title of his talk is Seriously, Can This Go On? The Future of Public Service Journalism. So I'd like you to give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. When I was approached and asked about acting as an adjunct professor in the School of Journalism 3-4 years ago, I gave it some thought, and I came back to Tom, and I said to him, "I'll do it, but only on condition that I can talk about practical things. So I can, give workshops and scripting and editing and news gathering and so on. And I'm not going to do any of this issues in journalism stuff, okay? But it turns out there's some small print in the contract, which says you are expected to talk at least once, maybe even twice, about issues in journalism. And I suppose that's no bad thing, because I'm a working reporter, so I spend my day, dealing with the immediate challenges of a working reporter, getting stories, getting the facts, trying to sort out the fact from the fiction, getting guests, getting people to talk about them, thinking the questions to ask them, conducting interviews, and so on, and then sometimes doing a little bit of reflection on how that went before we move on rapidly to the next thing. So actually standing back and trying to think about some of the bigger picture issues for someone like me is unusual. And I suppose because it's unusual, what's rare is wonderful, sometimes they say. So it's actually quite stimulating and quite interesting. So I've done a little bit of background research to try and prepare for this. It's not something I think about or talk about a great deal. And I suppose I should say, because again, it's in small print in my RTE contract, that the opinions I express here are my own and not RTE's. So if they're wise and intelligent and insightful, it's down to me. And if they're foolish and naive and idiotic, it's also down to me. You can't blame RTE on any of those counts. So I have a bit of a PowerPoint with me, just to sort of aid me as I go along. So what I'll do is I want to revisit some of the issues that I referred to or touched on in this. I did an inaugural lecture here about 3 years ago. And at the time I was saying I wanted to reflect a bit on what particularly public service broadcast journalism is up to, what role we serve, how we serve our public, our audiences, how we reflect the lives of the people that we report on, how the business of news is impacted by technological change, which of course, if anything, has simply gathered pace in those last number of years. So what I'll do is I'll try and revisit some of those this afternoon and try to share with you whatever insights I think I might have gained. I'm going to speak for the most part about old media, okay, particularly broadcasting, radio and television, because that's the end of the business I'm familiar with. I'm going to touch on new media and try and share some maybe insights of what RT's experience has been in that area, but it's not an area in which I have any particular expertise. I've got plenty of opinions, and I might share some of those as well in the course of the next half an hour or so. Nobody can ignore the huge impact of this technological change, of what social media is doing to how we interact with information and news, and I think it's something we need to talk about a little bit this afternoon. Now, having said that, Twitter and Facebook and the rest of them weren't even dreamt of when I started out in journalism all those years ago. In fact, I don't think even Mark Zuckerberg was a twinkle in his mother and dad's eye back in 1982. I had studied communications, although not finished the course in a college in Dublin. And I got involved in this outfit here, which was called Radio Nova. Now, one of the things that's different today, and it's a lot better today than all those years ago, is that I think today there are a lot more opportunities if you're trying to break into the journalism business. You can actually do it yourself. I mean, as you all know, you can set up your own online presence and you can start to build experience. Back in the day, that wasn't available, and there was very few opportunities to just start out writing, broadcasting, whatever it might be. Local newspapers, RTE. And although I lived only a few miles from RTE, it might as well have been on the far side of the moon, because I wasn't really going to be a candidate for the kind of vacancies that came up there. So I ended up working for this outfit here, which was a pirate radio station. And pirate radio was really expanding and very vibrant in the early 1980s. And so I started as a newsreader in a pirate radio station in about 1981, 1982, while I was still in college. And I did the job that I'm still doing today. 35 years later, I haven't really changed what I do. I go into work each day, I read the news, and I was doing that all those years ago. We also did programs for current affairs nature, and I got a lot of good experience there. And it was really an opportunity to realise what for me had been an ambition from some years before when I was in school. In transition year, I began to get an idea that journalism interested me. I suppose because I'm nosy, inquisitive, I ask a lot of questions. My sister turned up a cassette tape recently in which I was interviewing members of my own family at some family occasion. So I had that, but I also felt empowered by journalism. I was involved in producing a radio program, to digress slightly, in school, where I wasn't the presenter, I was the producer, where we interviewed the principal about certain issues relating to the school. And I can remember thinking about this. This is incredible. We get to sit down and put these questions, searching. Well, I don't know how searching they were, but they seemed searching questions to me at the time. Searching questions, somebody in authority. Isn't that an incredible responsibility? I suppose I've come to see it as an incredible responsibility to have, and what an exciting thing to do if you're able to do it for the rest of your life. So that kind of, if you like, is what lit the fuse. Then I moved on a bit, and I have to hit this twice. I got a job with the BBC in Northern Ireland, BBC Radio Ulster. And I suppose that's really where I kind of learnt the business. Because I was working as a reporter in current affairs, out on the road every day, 2 or 3 stories a day for the various current affairs programs in the morning, at lunchtime, at drive time. And it was a real opportunity just to build experience day after day after day. And I was very fortunate to have that opportunity. And every photograph shows a little bit more weight going on. And I also had an opportunity to work for this outfit here, which is BBC World Service, which had a producer in Belfast, a woman called Margaret McKee, who was a very exacting, very demanding producer. And I suppose the first time I came across somebody who expected what you did to be of the very highest standard, the scripting, the editing. She produced a weekly little magazine program from Northern Ireland to go out on the World Service Network. And I was in Africa some years later, and I met a taxi driver in Nairobi who had heard my programs. So, I mean, I know that we all take for granted now that what we do goes around the world and everything's global, but it was pretty exciting back then to be able to have that kind of opportunity. BBC World Service was something that gave me, I think, a real, if you like, enhanced my understanding of what it is to work, I hope, at the highest possible standards. One of my heroes, though, is this man here, Edward Orme Murrow. And Murrow I suppose he was one of the original news anchors. He was, in his day, a very famous radio and subsequently television broadcaster for CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting Corporation. And I suppose he made his reputation in the first instance as a reporter for American audiences in Europe during the Second World War. He was involved in the war right the way through, but he was one of the early people in Britain during the first stage of the war, where the Americans weren't involved at that stage, and he was broadcasting from London. And after a great deal of difficulty, he got permission to broadcast live from London during an air raid, during a German air raid. And these broadcasts in later years were regarded as helping to turn American opinion that little bit more in support of Britain at that stage of the conflict. It didn't bring the Americans into the war, that took Pearl Harbor, but he certainly, it was seen as helped the case, if you like, for supporting the British, and there were various initiatives before the Americans came in. And Murrow really established his credentials, his reputation. And I'm going to play one short, if we can do this now, I'm going to play one short little clip of one of his broadcasts as the air raid sirens go off in London. And actually, it's just as an aside, if you're thinking about how to script, how to tell a story, there's that phrase, a picture paints 1,000 words. Here are words that paint a really very vivid picture. And there's a great economy in the use of his language, and juxtapositions between the normality of life in the city, the buses, people walking around, the sea in front of them, and the air raid sirens going off, and the searchlights in the sky. He describes all that beautifully. It's very short, and have a listen to this.
This is Trafalgar Square. The noise that you hear at the moment is the sound of the air raid sirens. I'm standing here just on the steps of St. Martin's in the Fields. A searchlight just burst into action off in the distance. One single beam sweeping the sky above me now. People are walking along quite quietly. We're just at the entrance of an air raid shelter here, and I must move this cable over just a bit so people can walk in. There's another searchlight just square behind Nelson's statue. Here comes one of those big red buses around the corner. Double-deckers they are, just a few lights on the top deck. In this blackness, it looks very much like a ship that's passing in the night, and you just see the porthole.
Now, I think that even today that still has a capacity, does it, to be somewhat chilling to listen to that? Yeah. Imagine, whatever, is it 60 years ago, 70 years ago, when people really had only the vaguest notion of what an air raid was. And this was just a whole new kind of way of making war. So this was all very new to people. And to hear that description, I mean, the effect really on the audience must have been just most extraordinary. And I think an outstanding example of his reporting. Morrow wouldn't have described himself as a public service broadcaster. That's absolutely clear. He came from the American tradition of commercial, profit-driven television and radio. But I think it's also the case that much of Morrow's journalism was strongly motivated by meeting the interests of the public. He was driven, I think, if you look at his career, by what he saw as the public good, and that will become clear, I think, in just a moment or two. His reporting, to my mind, bore all the hallmarks of what we might regard as public service journalism. He tackled issues of public importance. He respected his audience, by which I mean he assumed that they were interested in matters of importance, in things that were serious, and he used all the tools of his trade, his own skills, to create radio and television journalism that was of significance and compelling. And in 1958, at the latter stages of his career, he delivered a landmark speech in Chicago to the Radio and Television News Directors Association, pleading that the powerful medium of television be employed to help confront and solve problems facing American society at the time, and not exclusively to distract people or to entertain them, or to take their attention away from the reality around them. It was a speech in which he expressed very directly, I think, one of the key principles of what we would call public service journalism. And what he said was, I beg your pardon, I've gone one too far. Have I got the... Okay, I'm going to flick through here, okay? All right. Hang on, I think I've lost a slide here, have I?
The one there? Oh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, there we go, sorry. I've reason to know, as many as do many of you, that when the evidence of a controversial subject is fairly and calmly presented, the public recognises it for what it is, an effort to illuminate rather than to agitate. In the same year that he delivered that speech, preparations were well advanced for the launch of Ireland's first television service. Now, the model here was going to be one that was publicly owned, but more by default than by design. John Bowman, who some of you may know as an RTE broadcaster, he's also a historian, and he's written a recent history of RTE television and says that it could not be claimed that there was any coherent state policy on television in the 1950s. There were numerous proposals for purely commercial service, and that was particularly strongly favoured, he says, by the Department of Finance, the people with the money bags, because they, I suppose, were concerned that public service television would be a drain on the public finances. In the end, though, the government of the day took the decision that television was something that should remain within the public domain. It should serve national interests and not just commercial ones. And so we had RTE, referred to as one of my colleagues as the Station of the Cross. The logo still survives in some form or other, I think, as a watermark. Actually, when you serve 25 years in RTE, they give you a kind of a doorstopper thing, a paperweight that has the St. Bridget's Cross worked into it. It's a lovely thing to get, of no use whatsoever, or no value either, apparently. But anyway, it's a charming gift. The license fee was introduced. But also the model was dual funding, so RTE would be funded both by commercial advertising, by revenue from advertising, but also by the license fee. But what happened is that once the station began making programmes and transmitting programmes, the public service remit, if you like, I suppose became a defining characteristic of RTE. Eventually it worked its way right into the DNA of the organisation, or what some people call groupthink. But anyway, it's very much part of the ethos, I think, of RTE. So my question, or what I'd like to talk a little bit about, what that means for those of us who are custodians, if I can use that phrase, custodians of the tradition in RTE and in RTE journalism. What responsibility does it place on us? I think we should first understand, though, that the environment in which we operate, all of us as journalists, is a very healthy one, and I think something we can be very thankful for, because there's such a strong appetite for news in this country, and for serious news, seriously presented and accompanied by good, sound analysis and discussion. These are the latest JNLR listenership figures. These are produced once every quarter, and these are the ones for quarter 4. So this is the situation at the end of 2017, and those are most, perhaps not all, but most of the, what I suppose are news or current affairs programmes on Irish radio. And if you look at the figures, they speak for themselves. And these are large numbers of people tuning in to listen to, what a lot of the time is fairly serious news and current affairs. Morning Ireland, which is my new home, I'm glad to say is the largest, most listened to radio programme in the country, which says something, I think, about the appetite for news and current affairs. That it's a news and current affairs programme that's the most listened to, News at 1, today with Sean O'Rourke and so on. And that doesn't include the tens of thousands of people who are listening while these programmes are on the air to local radio. Again, often doing very strong and very important current affairs to their local regional audiences. So that's, if you like, the environment in which we operate. I think it's something that we should be very grateful for, something that I think we're very fortunate about, because it means that out there is a receptive, interesting and engaged audience. The Morning Ireland figure, just in case I'm accused of blowing our own trumpet here, is actually down about 25,000 on the figure for a year ago. So it has seen, and that's quite a significant decline. What's happened though is most of that loss has gone to local radio, not to News Talk Breakfast or to other national stations. So local radio. I think maybe when the national agenda is of less urgency, we've come through a period, in relation to maybe our politics and certainly the economy, when the future of the nation has been very much in people's minds. That maybe is a little more settled now. So maybe there's some drift back to local radio. So, but they're still very strong figures. And a similar picture emerges when we look at the television situation. These are the TV ratings for the year of 2017. So they're averaged. And the figure on the left is the number of bums on seats, if I can put it that way. The people who are actually watching these programs, the average audience for these programs across the year. There'll be peaks and troughs and so on. And the figure on the right, it's a really interesting figure. It's the share. So it's the proportion of people watching television, watching that program. Understand? So it's how many people. So if you look at something like 6 o'clock news, over a third of the television audience, the available audience, is watching the news at 6 o'clock, and 14.5% have watched TV3 news at 5:30 and the 9 o'clock news. Now, those absolute figures have come down, fairly kind of markedly over the last number of years, and it's a fairly constant trend. There is a drift away from these more traditional media. But what's happened is that the share, which is the thing really I suppose that we look at most closely, the share has stayed reasonably constant. So of the available audience, these programs are still getting more or less that kind of share, although the overall audience is beginning to shrink. The other thing that might be worth noting is that 2/3 of the television news audience is over 55. Yeah, does that square with your own experience or your own use of media, if you like? 2/3 over 55. And just this, the figures are even more striking when something like this happens. So this is from Storm Emma, just the other week, 1st of March, Thursday the 1st of March. So you see how it jumps? So I suppose what we say is, well, when there's a big national crisis, a moment where people are really desperate to find out what's going on out there, they turn to trusted, well, I hope we can say trusted media outlets. You'd say, I didn't have a figure for TV3, but I think they had something like 300,000 for their 5:30 on that particular day. So, people turn over. It's also, of course, the fact that they're stuck indoors because it's snowing outside, it's a storm, and there's not much else to do if you don't want to talk to the other members of your family. So we'll turn on the TV. But we see that replicated at other big moments, all right? Now, there are other big moments in the past where we've had big audiences, but that's no longer the case. One of them, for example, is the budget. The budget day for our TV programmes used to be a big day, one of the biggest days of the year, along with St. Patrick's Day, which is another day when people are stuck at home, maybe not, well, in the old days when the pubs didn't open. So the budget day has fallen away as a day of importance to us, for the very obvious reason that people are able to access the information about the budget from their office or their desk or their phone, wherever it might be. They don't need to turn on any longer at 6 o'clock to find out what the Minister for Finance has said. So we see that pattern as well. There is another aspect to this. The weather. Evelyn. Sorry, this has just jumped slightly on me. Oh yes, there it is. 2.4 million viewers for the weather forecast over that week. 2.4 million viewers. That's the February 28th to March 4th. So that's the cumulative audience for that. And in fact, very often the weather forecast has a bigger audience than the news, which is a bit sort of, puts us in our place on the news side. This is a very secret chart which I managed to acquire. I can't tell you the source, other than that it is the traffic or the broadband usage of a particular internet provider, telecoms provider, broadband provider, on Thursday the 1st of March, the day of the storm. Okay. So what's interesting and why we were intrigued by it is that you can see that this is bits per second. I'm not sure what that means, but I mean there's obviously a lot of bits per second. Up towards what time? 6 o'clock, right? And then it dips. All right? See there? Look all right? Yeah. Comes down, and then it climbs again, and then takes another dip at 9 o'clock. Okay? So even people who are online getting information, getting all the information that they presumably could possibly digest or need about Storm Emma on this Thursday, when the whole country was in red mode lockdown, all right? People were turning off their computers, or some of them were. We don't want to exaggerate the effect, but there was an element of the public, of the audience of users, turning off their computers, stopping this activity online, and turning on the TV to find out, what was going on, even though presumably they've got plenty of access. And I'm intrigued by that because I think there's a sense in which we still hanker after not just information that you find discreetly, on your phone or whatever, but that we also, I think, want to know what's everybody else, what's the information that everybody's sharing in. It's the kind of that's why we watch Dancing with the Stars. Well, I don't, but people watch Dancing with the Stars because it's the water cooler moment. Isn't it the next day you can say what you think of Herbert? And I think there's a little bit of that with this, people tuning in at these moments to find out, well, what is the kind of shared experience or shared information about all this? What's RTE or TV3 saying about this story? How do they prioritize it? I think people are still looking for that kind of sense of value or priority or whatever the phrase is. That will self-destruct a little bit like the files on Cambridge Analytics, okay? But only once I finish with it. So there's still, I think, a lot of resilience in traditional media, but obviously, for an organisation like RTE, the online presence is really, I suppose, where the future lies for us. The RTE News app, again, I've dug out a few figures which might interest you. Since the app was launched, there have been 1.9 million downloads. I believe that's a lot. Certainly seems like a lot in a country with a population of 4 million. I'm guessing most of them, I don't know, I didn't get the background, but I'm guessing most of them, not all, but most of them are domestic. I mean, there are going to be Irish people overseas who want to follow what's happening here, but I would think a lot of it is domestic. So in terms of that sort of connection or reach into the community, that's, I suppose from RT's point of view, that's kind of a satisfying statistic, okay? But what about people's usage of it? Well, the average number of downloads per month is 20,000. There were 25,000 in the course of the month of February, which was the bad weather, I think, coming up. So a lot of people were maybe downloading it. So slightly higher than average downloads for the month. And the number of page impressions. I mean, these numbers kind of boggle my mind. I'm not too sure, 84 million page impressions for that period, September to February. And, the statistics on how long people stay on them and so on. They don't stay too long, actually. That's the main thing. They kind of glance and they go. Although one of the phenomena that we've noticed is that sometimes we get correspondents or reporters to do a long read, usually put it up at the weekend, and they're very popular. I didn't have the figures with me, but they are getting a lot of interest, a lot of traction. So people are sitting down, reading what Tony Connolly has to say about the latest turn, the Brexit story, or Sean Whelan on something on the economy, or one of the specialist correspondents. And of course, what happens is when correspondents and reporters in an organisation like RTE see that people are reading their stuff, they go, I'll do another one of those. I'll do it, and they put more effort and more energy and more research. So it's sort of it's a virtuous circle, it's a sort of self-fulfilling circle. Why do we have these scale of audiences and level of activity online for news? Well, I think it's a phenomenon which is partly explained by the fact that we're a small country, and that we're still a closely knit society, I think quite homogeneous, and I think we're all very curious still, about our neighbours. And in Ireland, in that sense, I think Ireland is a kind of it's a sort of big neighbourhood. I was just as an aside, I was struck that in the UK during Storm Emma, there were hundreds of people stuck in cars on motorways for hours. Did you see that? People in 12 hours on some motorway in the West Midlands. And I said, why were they? And it was because they didn't have that sense of everybody tuning in to listen to what Owen Murphy or the Taoiseach says, we're going to have a red alert, stay at home. We all pay attention because we're a small society. Obviously it passed people in the UK by completely, and they jumped into their car and found themselves in these dreadful situations. But I think we're a very different kind of society in Ireland, and I think partly it's our size, and really that we're still quite a homogeneous society. That of course is changing as well. The media, all of the media, particularly I think electronic media, are a kind of a garden fence that we lean on to chat to the person next door, to complain about the state of the footpaths or find out more about the family that have moved in at number 7. And these programmes and others besides, I think, are what help to bind us together as a community. Really, they're what make us a coherent, I think still quite a coherent society. They give us an understanding of our shared experience, of the issues we're facing as a society, and the choices that we make in trying to shape our future. But television and radio in Ireland, publicly owned or indeed now privately owned, didn't just develop, I think, this, if you like, this ethos by accident. The public service ethos, which directs RTE, demands, I think, from all of us who work in the organisation, that the medium be used to reflect back the Irish community to itself. That's a really important part, I think we feel, of what we do, to let Irish people tell stories to each other. Public service broadcasting in Ireland, publicly funded, and that's, I suppose, a key which I'll talk about in a moment or two, has enabled audiences, I believe, to coalesce, to come together, and equally important, has sustained those audiences over a very long period of time now. The one thing that public service journalism in Ireland has done is to create a benchmark, all right? And it's a benchmark which I think sets a number of standards. First of all, RTE is legally obliged to be fair, to be impartial, to be objective. Its presenters, people like me, are absolutely prohibited from using our position to express personal views, certainly personal views on matters of public importance. So we've managed to maintain in this country, and not just in RTE, but also in the commercially funded sector as well, and most of the time, I think a media that invites a huge variety of points of view to be heard. It is a very open arena. We've largely avoided this dreadful phenomenon you see elsewhere of the echo chamber. People still hear opinions on radio, on television, and indeed very much online as well, I think, opinions that they might disagree with. They're forced to confront, if you like, arguments which are at odds with their own view and which might actually also change or modify their own mindset. Another part of that benchmark, that journalism benchmark, I think the public service broadcasting has embedded in the culture of journalism in this country, is that we treat our audiences, by and large, as intelligent adults. We know that significant numbers of people will watch serious news and current affairs. They want to discuss the issues of the day. They care enough about their communities, about their families, to inform themselves about what's happening around them. And what that means is that commercial broadcasters, in turn, as they've arrived on the scene in the last, 20 or more years now, I think they see the value of promoting news and current affairs programmes as a key part of their schedule. And you see that if you look at the schedules of commercial broadcast organisations. And in that sense, we support, if you like, and sustain each other's audiences. TV3 is an excellent, very good, solid audience for its news output, particularly the news at 5:30, and they've invested in recent years a lot more in it. And I think they're reaping some of the rewards of that. And the Tonight Show with Matt Cooper and Ivan Yates, they're a bit of an odd couple, but again, they're adding diversity and they are adding something else to the range of current affairs programmes that are available to Irish audiences. I can make similar comments about News Talk, or indeed, as I've already alluded, the impact of local radio. So the question arises then, why not leave the field to the commercial broadcasters? Why shouldn't RTE just get off the pitch? The job's already been done. Well, there are two reasons, I think, principally, why I don't think that should be the case. And they're both linked to the question of public funding and the public service obligation which comes with that. And it's about serving, I believe, the best interests of the audience. Firstly, news and current affairs is one of RTE's core obligations to its audience. It's not something that is chosen, an optional extra, and that at some point you might decide to pull back from it. And secondly, because it's a core objective, it means there's a commitment by RTE to invest significant resources in what I hope is quality journalism, and to present it prominently in the schedule. And that commitment can be measured in a number of ways. The RTE News and Current Affairs annual budget is €35 million, which is a great deal of money. And that's the actual above-the-line cost of running the service. If you add in the sort of the share, if you like, of the corporate services, law, the legal services, human resources, if you add in areas that aren't actually part of News and Current Affairs, like radio current affairs, which is separate, so drive time, the tonight, the evening programme, and so on, the today, Saturday with Claire Byrne, or as was Cormac O'Hara, they're added on top. So you put all that together, RTE is spending about 60 million on news and current affairs in any given year. So I think it's probably the biggest spend, single organisational spend among any organisation. I don't know what the papers are, but I can't imagine that it's in that sort of scale. And mainly what that does is it employs people. News is a people business, so there are 275 full-time equivalents. So there's more people actually working, but they're not all full-time. But if you add them all up to full-time, and again, that's a substantial number of people, and that's where a lot of the cost goes. And it's an investment in news gathering. And that's what they do. They get out there and they find stories and they produce programs and they deliver news to our audience. And if I break it down further, a foreign bureau, and we've only got three, Washington, New York, Washington, Brussels and London. Brussels and Washington would each be about $500,000 to run. Now that's not the salary of the reporter. That's largely the costs associated with renting office space, with hiring crews, with editing, a certain amount of travel, I suppose. So it's the costs involved in running an office in either of those locations. London, I don't have a figure for London, but I think it's probably somewhat cheaper because there isn't actually an office. The correspondent in London works from home. But for RTE, it's very important, and these are big costs. And every time there's pressure on budgets, questions are asked about this kind of expense. But it's so important for a news organisation like RTE, a national news organisation, to have a presence in somewhere like Washington with the Trump story and the implications it has for us here, as well as just the implications for the whole world, and to be in somewhere like Brussels with what's happening, particularly at the moment. And what happens is if you invest in people and you put people in there and you let them get on with the job, then if they're good people, they'll produce outstanding journalism. And someone like Tony Connolly is, I think, leading the way in terms of coverage on the Brexit story, to the extent that he keeps getting phoned up by the BBC to find out what's going on. And he's established very much his authority on that story because he's been on that European beat now for probably a decade or more. And he knows people and he gets the story, he knows what's going on, he gets his hands on the information, and as importantly, because of his experience, he is also in a position to assess the story and to make judgments and to, if you like, to sort out the wheat from the chaff. So these are big investments, but they're absolutely vital, I would say, if you want to produce a news output that is going to meet the demands, the reasonable expectations of the audience. Did I have any other figures? RTE investigates. This is the division, or the unit that was set up after the Father Reynolds controversy. Are any of you familiar with that? There was a libel case in which RTE lost and did a lot of reputational damage at the time. And it was an investigative piece. And one of the responses of RTE at the time was to, in one sense, get back up on the horse again, to recommit to investigative journalism. And a unit was established to do that, and has produced a whole series of groundbreaking reports, which have in some cases led to legislative change. Yesterday there was a court case in the European Court of Justice about the hooded men, these people who were, the court said they weren't tortured, but they suffered inhuman and degrading treatment in Northern Ireland in the 70s. And the case was managed to get back into the court again because of a programme and an investigation done by RTE Investigates. And that happens again and again and again. So it's a big investment. Mostly it's the investment in the staff, because it's a people business. It's about going out and finding the stories and hitting the phone and talking to people and sifting the evidence. And it's an investment which, and I'll come and talk a bit more about this, but probably wouldn't happen other than that there is public funding available. RT Specialist Corp, I won't delay too money on these, but that's another large investment in people in each corner of the country, pretty well. I'm looking at this from the side. They're the specialist correspondents. So again, it's an investment in people who have an area of expertise. And the point about this, and the foreign correspondents and the regional people, who I'll show you in a moment, is that they're not necessarily on the air every day. So there's a kind of an opportunity cost, if you like, the economists talk about. So they're not going to be producing stories 7 days a week, but they're going to be producing stories that matter when they're on the air. And they're expected, obviously, to deliver stories and to be self-starters, and they are all in that case. So, and they're also people who have expertise, so if we need to talk to somebody on air about a health story, about a social affairs story, about something to do with agriculture, we can put these people on the air, and they can, again, give us the benefit of their understanding and their insights. And again, the same thing applies with regional correspondents, who are people who are in the community. So when a story breaks, I was thinking last year we had the first anniversary of the helicopter that went down, 116. And when 116 went down, Pat McGrath, who's in Galway, Western correspondent, went to Belmullet, and he was dealing with people he knew. So when they saw him coming down the road, here's a familiar face, somebody they trusted, they were willing to talk to him. He wasn't somebody, a fireman or a firewoman who arrived from Dublin or somewhere trying to desperately work out who's who. He's on familiar territory, and there's an enormous benefit in that, as well as actually generating stories that you wouldn't get otherwise. So this is what you get for 35 million euro. Okay, this is where it's spent, and it appears on the screen. Okay, it's an investment in output. All right. And the other thing is that, and this is a striking aspect of current affairs programs, and news, is that many of them are still broadcast at times of the day when audiences are at their largest, at prime time, if you like. Because what's happened elsewhere is that increasingly news and current affairs have been shifted that much closer to the margins. The BBC News now is at 10 o'clock. Now, I'm not saying 10 o'clock is the margins of the schedule, but it's another little panorama now goes out at, I can't remember the last time I watched it live going out, but again, it's going out at more and more remote times. In America, a lot of news programs are either in the early evening or late at night, and yet in this country, news and current affairs still really occupies the centre ground of broadcasting because it delivers audiences. I suppose if it stopped delivering the audiences, then the pressure would come on for it to lose those slots. So these programs are transmitted at times when large audiences are available, and they in turn attract large audiences. And in my view, there's no reason why news and current affairs broadcasting shouldn't be popular broadcasting. I don't really buy the argument that you can do great stuff for niche audiences, and certainly not in a country as small as ours, and certainly not for RTE, which really has to justify its licence fee, I believe, by generating large audiences. We shouldn't be in a position where I think people are paying, everybody is paying through a licence fee for programmes that are watched by the few. It would make the licence fee harder and harder to justify, and eventually I think it would simply erode and wither away. So our obligation, I think, is to provide at times of the day when people are watching a service to the entire community, particularly in news, and that means producing quality journalism and quality programmes with a wide appeal, particularly in a country as small as ours. I think it also has another benefit if you're if your connection is with the general wide audience, is that it keeps you connected. You know, we talk a lot about you know, our audiences, you know, how big they are or how small they are. We have presentations in news every month to which everybody's invited of the audience figures for the previous month, and these are discussed and you know, thought about, and we reflect on them because we want to engage the widest possible audience that we can attract. And RTE, as a result of all of this, allocates considerable airtime to news and current affairs, and supports that with a significant news gathering operation. But that has to be paid for. All right, 35 million doesn't sort of just land in your lap. Advertising revenue covers some of the cost, but the balance comes out of the license fee. €160 per year. You all knew that, I presume. And the future of the license fee is really very much up in the air at the moment, if you've been following any of those debates. Ireland has one of the highest evasion rates of license fee anywhere in the EU. It's heading towards 14%, compared to 7% in the UK. Now I asked, how do you know how many people are evading the license fee if they're evading the license fee? And it's done on the basis of household surveys, the number of households, and the number of households, you know, assuming most households, if not all households, have a TV. It's a fairly apparently straightforward calculation to make. Another 9% of households are now declaring themselves to be television free. So they say we don't have to have we don't pay a license, we don't have a TV. And you go in and you can sign a declaration. Of course, you can then watch the TV on the laptop, but if you don't have a TV, you're not obliged to pay the license. So what all this is costing RTE, and not just RTE, because license fee funding is available to commercial broadcasters as well, but it's costing an estimated 50 million per year. So if you compare that with the total budget for news and current affairs of 35 million, or even if you compare 60 million, 50 million a year is a huge chunk of revenue that should be available for making programs, for broadcasting and journalism and whatever it might be in this country. The Director General of RTE, my boss, Dee Forbes, in the last annual report, said that the persistent failure to reform the TV licence system has and is costing jobs across the sector. It's causing a stark reduction in Irish-made television programming, is threatening the provision of trusted news and current affairs, and is having a stifling effect on the potential of the broadcasting sector as a whole. That's my only quote from the Director General in the course of this presentation. And all of that in an environment which is changing very, very rapidly, because these guys apparently are the future. These are the big beasts of the media world in the 21st century, as we're all very aware. They're hoovering up advertising, which was going, or might otherwise go, to old media. They're eroding audiences, to some extent, for radio and television. They're facilitating the spread of fake news, and they're marginalising traditional news organisations and marginalising the values of traditional news organisations. Now, there are positives. They're promoting global debate as never before. You know, they're giving a voice to many people who might otherwise be voiceless, and creating an arena in which people can campaign and can agitate and press for change. And the Me Too campaign is just one example of that. And they're also diluting the power, you know, of traditionally powerful institutions in finance, in politics, in the arts, in business, and so on. So it's very much a disruptive technology. But maybe this is just this week, we can say that we're reaching a kind of tipping point in relation to our relationship with the new online media. I mean, if we look at the controversy surrounding Facebook in relation to Cambridge Analytica, it's quite clear that Facebook's internal governance structures have been overwhelmed, or else they're not interested in meeting, I think, what everyone would expect to be their obligations to protect the data that they get from us. And that's going to be very damaging. It's already hit their share price, but also I think it's going to be potentially very damaging to their reputation. And I think if we're in old media concerned that some of these new media are going to threaten our role, if you like, as news providers, I think maybe this is a good week, a week in which we might feel a little bit more optimistic about the future, because I think people are beginning to realise that actually a lot of these companies cannot be trusted sources of news and information. I have two daughters in their 20s who sometimes will say they get their news from Facebook. Well, they don't get their news from Facebook. They might access news on Facebook, but they're getting news from people who go out and gather and collect news and then put it on Facebook. But Facebook is not a provider of news. And I think we're discovering also that actually in some of its the way it operates, it facilitates falsification, fake news, lies, and we're also discovering allows data to be misused, data which is provided by its millions of users around the world. There's a great phrase, and I had occasion to use it earlier today, that in relation to these online companies, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. All right? So what they want, of course, is access to our personal data, which could be used for very positive purposes, but also obviously can be abused. I mean, I followed the debates about Facebook and online bullying and revenge porn, and I'm always fascinated by people from Facebook come forward and say, well, we're very robust in how we deal with these. As soon as we discover there's a problem here, that something's gone up online, we take it down. We take it down? They do nothing, it seems, to stop it going up in the first place. And I think they're going to be under increasing pressure to acknowledge the fact that they are actually publishers. They really don't want to be described as that. They say, no, we create an ecosystem. We're facilitators. They are, I think, increasingly going to have to confront the fact that they are publishers, and if you're a publisher, you have to take editorial responsibility, and if you're going to take responsibility, then you have to exercise control. And I think they're going to be increasingly pushed in that direction, and are going to have to respond to that. And if they don't do it themselves, I think they're going to find themselves facing increasing regulatory pressures to do that. So, this is the world we live in now. Like everybody else, I get a lot of my news on my phone, wherever I want it, whenever I want it. Although some news organisations are now beginning to actually modulate the times of the day. I think it's the London Times now, which updates its online content 3 or 4 times a day. So we're not going to chase every story every minute of the day. We're going to say, well, we're going to give you effectively a news summary, in the morning, and again at lunchtime, tea time, and later in the evening. So again, inviting people to come at a particular time to get a digest of information that presumably is relative to them. But of course, the more things change, the more they stay the same, don't they, in some ways? Most of us, whether we're in the smartphone or, increasingly rarely picking up a newspaper, we're looking for information that's going to entertain us, that's going to engage us, that's going to inform us, it's going to help us shape our view of the world around us. And I think what the real question for all of us in the media and journalism is a question of trust. Can we be trusted? Can the journalism we produce be trusted? And I really do believe that if old media are to have a future as providers of news and information, it is as providers of news and information that can be trusted, that can be believed. Now, I'm not going to say that we don't get things wrong and mistakes aren't made, and the first draft of history is sometimes a very rough draft, but that by and large the motivation of those who are involved in producing the news is to produce something that's truthful and honest and as full a picture as possible. And particularly in public service broadcasting, we're going to have to stand by the principle that our role is to illuminate, to try to promote calm and reasoned debate where possible. For me, television and radio news interviews, journalism in general, are about gathering information, about testing the validity of an argument, about questioning assumptions. And we need to create that space and continue to create a space, an arena, if you like, where issues that matter to people can be discussed and debated. They can be discussed and debated vigorously, and the right of all sides to be heard can be respected. The task is to facilitate illumination rather, I suppose, than agitation, which was the title of the previous presentation I made. The other task of reporters and journalists, I think, is to make some sense of the world to people who are very busy or bewildered or both, to try and, if you like, put a narrative on what is happening. We shouldn't claim any special insight, other than the capacity to shift through evidence, to evaluate it, to judge its importance, to tell the story. Stories, a narrative, if you like, are how human beings engage with each other, and how we understand each other, and how we make sense of the world around us. You find stories pretty well everywhere. In our religion and in our history. Of course, one of the interesting things about the story of our nation is that it changes. The narrative shifts with time, but it's how we make sense of things even that happen, in our own world today. The narrative of a wonderful sporting win Joe Schmidt's young team, the guys who had to be brought in because of the injuries and who create this great moment, and who mean that there's going to be a terrific future for Irish rugby. All the time we're looking to make sense. That's, as reporters, we're always urged to put things in context, if you like. And I often think actually context is about creating that narrative, making sense of something that seems random and isolated. Why is this happening? Why has Ireland won the Grand Slam? Well, there's a narrative there. There's a story that you can tell. And as journalists, I think it's very important that we don't just report facts, but that we create that narrative and we tell that story and we make sense, if you like, of the world around us to our audiences. So if we want to be able to communicate, to continue to tell each other stories that matter, we need a vibrant, we need a financially secure, and we need a trusted media. And I think we should also have some clear objectives of the kind of media we want in this country. And I offer a couple of benchmarks, if you like, or criteria. I think it should be, as far as possible, Irish-owned and Irish-run, whether it's public or private. I think media, particularly news media, should be diverse of ownership, because I think that that's really the best, perhaps the only guarantee of a truly free media, is that ownership is diverse. I think public service broadcasting should continue. You'll hardly be surprised to hear me say that. Continue to be adequately funded for the reasons I've tried to outline, but it should also be fully accountable for that funding. And I think one thing RTE could do to help this debate is be more transparent about how public funding is used, to report in its annual reports what programmes, what output is funded by the licence fee and what output is financed by commercial revenue. Now, it's not necessarily that easy to be very clear-cut about it, but I think RTE could go some way towards assisting the debate about public funding of broadcasting and of online media and of all the things that RTE and others do if there was greater transparency. The basic standards of fairness and objectivity should remain central in our broadcast journalism, so that we ensure that our media remain truly public arenas, open to all, where people can be heard and treated with respect. If I go back to conclude to Ed Murrow, even at the high point of his career, when he was in the 1950s, he was to some extent swimming against the grain of popular opinion and the consensus. It was one of the characteristics, if you like, of his career. In the 1950s, when he was at his height, there were bigger audiences to be had from output other than news. It was the era of the game show, which was beginning to become extremely popular. And they were much less costly, and they didn't result in lawyers' letters and threats to sue you and all the rest of the stuff that comes with journalism. So a programme that he produced called the See It Now actually ceased weekly broadcasts in the 1950s. It became an occasional series and went off the air in 1958. So the speech he delivered was after that, and maybe he was feeling a little bitter, maybe he was feeling a bit let down by the broadcasters, by the people who he'd worked for. In the speech I quoted from earlier, he said, as I've said and I believe, potentially we have in this country, America, a free enterprise system of radio and television which is superior to any other. But to achieve its promise, it must be both free and enterprising. There's no suggestion here that networks or individual stations should operate as philanthropies, but I can find nothing in the Bill of Rights or the Communications Act which says that they must increase their net profits each year lest the Republic collapse. Now, you can make up your own mind about whether Murrow's warning was heeded. America continues to produce some really fine journalism, but in parts also its broadcasting has become shrill and it's certainly highly partisan. Murrow, to me, is a giant of broadcast journalism. He was eloquent, diligent, but also modest. And in that same speech, he offered some advice that perhaps is even more relevant in the age of Twitter and Facebook than it was all those years ago, when the old media of television that he worked in was still something that was sparkling and new. He said, "It is not necessary to remind you that the fact that your voice is amplified to the degree where it reaches from one end of the country to the other does not confer upon you greater wisdom or understanding than you possessed when your voice reached only from one end of the bar to the other." A sort of manifesto for the social media age. Thanks very much indeed.